it is time to talk about the player that I've been most looking forward to talking about, even though I've already talked about him so much, and I've talked about him in the last two player preview videos, but that is DeMar DeRozan. This whole summer has pretty much revolved around DeMar DeRozan, and I've talked about him so much, but there's still so much more to talk about, even in the previous two videos with De'Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis. A lot of the time was devoted to, how those guys fit with DeMar DeRozan, but still, there is a lot to talk about in this episode of the player previews that is just strictly dedicated to DeMar DeRozan. But before we get into that, a special shout out to Cody Willis, who achieved legendary status on this channel by becoming the first ever member. You too can become a member on this channel. Are there a lot of perks? Not yet. Maybe there will be coming. I have some ideas. But you do get shouted out just like Cody here. So thank you so much to Cody Willis, because you didn't have to do that, and that does mean a lot to me. So now let's get right into talking about what to expect from DeMar DeRozan coming into his first season in Sacramento. And I think the very first thing to acknowledge is kind of the misconceptions that people who obviously did not watch the Kings a lot last season had about this Kings team. Because the people who don't follow the Kings closely, they are a year behind. This is not the same Kings team, or last season's Kings team is not the same Kings team as the team of 2 years ago. And what I mean by that is they aren't the same, or weren't the same last season, the same offensive juggernaut, the same number one offense in NBA history. Because not only did the West just get better around them, because that definitely did happen. The West got better, but also the Kings offense got worse. And really in the NBA nowadays, you have to constantly be improving your offense to keep pace with everyone else. But the Kings got worse offensively, but they did get much better defensively. And I think one of the big reasons why the Kings did regress so much offensively is the regression of Harrison Barnes, because Harrison Barnes regressed and he kind of moved down the pecking order offensively, but that meant that certain players had to move up the pecking order offensively who weren't really fit for the roles that they were kind of forced into. They had to take on more offensive burden than they could really handle. You look at like Sabonis, Keegan, Monk, even Herter, like kind of having to move up the offensive pecking order. And, some guys like Malik Monk, he had the best season of his career and he thrived, but there still wasn't enough help. And obviously, like Kevin Herter had a rough season, and Keegan Murray was down in terms of his 3-point percentage. And so that's where DeMar comes in. He slots into Harrison Barnes' offensive roles and defensive roles for that matter. And he pushes everyone down in the pecking order back to where they should be and where they kind of were 2 seasons ago when the Kings had that great offense. And not only does he slot into Harrison Barnes' roles offensively, but he also elevates them. And I think that one of the statistics that really shows Harrison Barnes' regression and where DeMar DeRozan will really improve over last season's Harrison Barnes is the free throw numbers. In the past 2 seasons, Barnes averaged 5.4 free throws per game and 5 free throws a game. And last season, 2.4 attempts per game. So his free throw numbers got cut in half. He was still shooting 80%, which is solid, but he was just attempting a lot less free throws last season because Barnes was still a solid catch and shoot shooter. But that was about the only thing he did most games. Consistently, he was a good catch and shoot shooter, but he wasn't consistently good at anything else offensively. Now, when you look at DeMar DeRozan's numbers, in the last 4 seasons, all 4 seasons, he has attempted over 7 free throws per game. And in those 4 seasons, he's also shot over 85% from the free throw line. And we all know the Kings had a massive free throw problem last season, and that was both getting to the line and converting those free throws. DeMar just adds that different element to the Kings offense when they get stuck in a rut. he can make something happen. He can get to the free throw line. Hopefully he maintains that free throw percentage, because if you saw when he went off in that the Drew League final, he also missed 5 free throws. So hopefully it's not, the King's curse coming to get him where now he's missing free throws. But as long as he stays over that 80% mark, we should be totally fine. And then when you look at the other ways that DeMar fits into the Kings offense, he's going to change how the Kings play in certain ways, because although the dribble handoff frequency went down slightly last season, the Kings were still a heavy dribble handoff team. And you look at the way Barnes and Herter play off Domantas Sabonis, Barnes coming around that screen. If they go under, he stops halfway, pops that 3. DeMar's not going to be doing that. He's not going to be pulling up from 3 very much. He's just not a good pull-up 3-point shooter, but he can still operate in those dribble handoffs in a different way. Because if defenders go under, if he can get around that screen quick enough and get going downhill, that still puts a lot of pressure on the defense. And one of his maybe most underrated attributes is his playmaking. And so that means if he does get going downhill, he's going to make the right decision a lot of times. Or if they back off too far, one step inside the 3-point line, and he's money, he can navigate around those screens. I think he's going to have a field day navigating around Sabonis screens, who's one of the best screeners in the NBA. Like I talked about in the last video, that was about Sabonis. And I really hope, and I think we're going to see a great relationship between Sabonis and DeMar. I think they're going to love playing with each other. I think people question the spacing between those two. But I think the only time where the spacing really comes into question, it's not when Sabonis has the ball, it's not when DeMar has the ball, but it's probably when someone else, like Fox mainly, has the ball. And so that's going to force DeMar DeRozan to play off the ball more. And so how can he make an impact off the ball? And I think for one, guys can't just sag off of him. When you think of non-shooters, that doesn't happen. Guys don't just sag off of him and help into the paint, although they can help more off of him. But the one thing DeMar is really good at, and what makes him a versatile offensive player that I don't think he really gets credit for, is if he is left open at the 3-point line, there are a few things he can do. One, he can get downhill and get into the paint. But if the paint is too crowded, obviously we know of his mid-range game, but also he can shoot the 3. He shot 29.8% on pull-up 3s last season, but 34.5% on catch-and-shoot 3s. So is 34.5% great? No, it's definitely not. But it's respectable enough for him to shoot at certain points. Like especially if you look at his left corner 3, he shot 45 threes from the left corner and shot 44.4% on those, with every single one of his makes being assisted. So he can be a catch and shoot corner 3 guy, especially in that left corner. The numbers in the right corner, not the biggest sample size, but he was 8 for 26 from the right corner, so not quite as good. But pretty much I just think he has multiple different options if guys sag off of him on the 3-point line, so I don't really see that as being very much of a problem. Plus, when you look at Fox and his ability to shoot in the mid-range, obviously you do want him getting to the rim, but when you talk about spacing, having a guy like Fox and DeRozan that can both shoot in the mid-range, it really makes spacing less of a factor, because when you think about bad spacing, you're thinking about teams packing the paint. And so if you're not getting all the way to the rim, obviously the mid-range, not the most efficient shot and not something you want to rely on heavily in today's NBA, but it's just a way of keeping defenses honest. And I am excited to see how DeMar is going to be as a cutter off the ball. I'm also interested in seeing plays where you have DeMar setting screens for Fox or vice versa, and seeing the relationship that those two develop, because I think we know, the relationship between DeMar and Sabonis is going to be good, and the relationship between Fox and Sabonis is already good, but how will that relationship with each other be? One thing I think we're going to see a lot of is the Kings setting screens, trying to get DeMar DeRozan into the mid post to get him the ball there, because for some reason, that's something the Kings liked to do a lot last season with Harrison Barnes, and it didn't work. But now you actually have a guy that it can work for, because like when you look at the assist numbers, like the percentage of field goals made that were assisted, Barnes was at 77.5%. He wasn't creating a lot for himself. You look at DeMar DeRozan, it's 34.8%. He is an ISO scorer, and you can get him that ball in the mid post. And that's a very dangerous spot for him to be, because he can just raise up and shoot over guys. And I think that's only going to help guys like Keegan and Kevin Huerter, because when you're screening to get him the ball in that mid post, that's just going to open up other things on the 3-point line for shooters. Offensively, I just think this is going to be a perfect fit. I think this is exactly the type of player the Kings needed offensively. Defensively is where the legit questions can be asked. But I think the one thing we all need to remember is that Harrison Barnes was an awful defender. Okay, like, again, you see those people who you obviously know didn't watch the Kings last season be like, man, they got rid of this, a solid defender in Harrison Barnes. No. Harrison Barnes was awful defensively last season. This is not a downgrade in any way. Barnes provided no rim protection, no weak side help, no on-ball defense. He was a traffic cone out there, where the only time it worked was if someone just went straight into him and tried to go through him, because he could stand his ground. He was a strong player. But anytime you ask Barnes to move anywhere, to rebound the ball, it just wasn't happening. Now, DeMar isn't much better, when it comes to like rebounding the ball. He's a little better rebounding the ball. In terms of guarding on the ball, he's not great anymore at this age. He's lost a little bit of his athleticism. But the reason that I actually think that this is going to be a little upgrade, not a lot, but a little upgrade defensively, is because when you put DeMar on the weak side as the low man, I think he's better at recognizing plays and pouncing on them and disrupting things early. Because once the opposing players get the ball around the rim, he's not going up and blocking a shot. But he's better than Barnes at disrupting plays early on. And just, I think that defensive IQ, or maybe it's not even the defensive IQ, but just the ability to actually jump the play. Maybe Barnes could recognize those plays, but he just wasn't quick enough to be able to act on that. And the Kings were a good defensive team. Well, they were an average defensive team all season, and they were a good defensive team once Keon Ellis got into the starting lineup. I'm interested to see how much they utilize DeMar as like the primary on-ball defender on certain guys, like they did with Harrison Barnes, like a Zion or a Giannis at times, like a LeBron, because that might not be great. And so that might mean you look at putting Sabonis on some of those guys, which could be interesting, because we saw it towards the end of the season, putting him on Giannis. And he's just, Sabonis doesn't get credit for how quick he is laterally. Like, he can stay in front of guys, and he's obviously very strong. And he was much better at going straight up at the rim last season and not getting into foul trouble, because that's the main worry if you're asking Sabonis to like guard some of those guys. So I think you could put Sabonis on some of like the really big wings, possibly. But that's just obviously the hole in this roster. And the Kings still have, a spot in their starting lineup that they could use to have a bigger wing to defend those guys. And so that's obviously where I think the biggest improvement could be made, where instead of starting a Keon Ellis, a Kevin Huerter, or a Malik Monk, you're starting a bigger wing. But I just think, with the roster as is, DeMar DeRozan is going to be just fine, or the team is going to be just fine slotting in DeMar DeRozan for Harrison Barnes, because it's just not a downgrade in any way, in my opinion. And just a couple last thoughts on, DeMar's offensive fit. I think you're going to see Fox have the ability to play more off the ball. And I mentioned the stat of DeMar having 34.8% of his field goals assisted. Well, Fox was even less at 32.5%. So I'm interested to see if Fox starts scoring more off of assists from DeRozan or vice versa. I think that relationship is the most interesting one. and the one with the most questions around it is how Fox and DeMar coexist. And to be clear, I think they totally can, and I think it's going to work well, but it's just like, what is the balance there, in terms of my turn, your turn type of thing with the ball. But really, it's just going to help the Kings offense when one of them goes off the court. The other one can still be out there, because that was definitely a problem last season at times when Fox was off the court. At times, it definitely was difficult offensively. And so that's really where I think it's going to be a big help. But anyways, that is it for this player preview. I got a request to do Keegan Murray next, so that one is on the way. You can request who you want to see next. I'm actually pretty excited to do the Kevin Huerter one, because I think he could possibly have a bounce back season. But make sure to subscribe, turn on those notifications so you see the next player previews when they get posted, and I will see you guys later. Peace.